In 1937, the Japanese Navy issued a specification that most Western engineers considered a suicide mission. They demanded a carrier-based monoplane capable of carrying a massive 1,800-pound torpedo, reaching speeds over 230 miles per hour and possessing a folding wing system compact enough to fit on the cramped elevators of the Akagi and Kaga. The result was the Nakajima B-5N, an aircraft that would eventually be known by the Allied code name Kate. At its debut, it wasn't just a good airplane, it was arguably the most advanced naval strike aircraft in the skies, leaving American and British designs looking like relics of a bygone era. The secret to the Kate's performance was its uncompromising, almost fanatical devotion to weight reduction and aerodynamic purity. To achieve its incredible range and speed, the designers utilized flush riveting across the entire airframe to reduce drag. They implemented a unique hydraulic wing fold system where the wings folded upward, overlapping each other across the cockpit to save every possible inch of deck space. Powering this machine was the Sakai 11 radial engine, the same high-performance heart used in the legendary Zero fighter. This gave the Kate a power-to-weight ratio that allowed it to outrun almost any interceptor it encountered during the first year of the war. However, this performance came with a dark trade-off. To make the plane light enough to carry a heavy torpedo over long distances, the engineers stripped away every piece of safety equipment. The Kate had zero armor plating for the crew and no self-sealing fuel tanks. It was essentially a high-speed fuel tank wrapped in a thin aluminum skin. The pilots knew that a single well-placed burst of machine gun fire would turn the aircraft into a flying blowtorch. This was not a weapon built for a long war of attrition. It was a precision instrument built for a single, overwhelming knockout blow. The true lethality of the Kate, however, was not just the plane itself, but the weapon it carried, the Type 91 Thunderfish. In the late 1930s, the U.S. Navy felt safe in harbors like Pearl Harbor because the water was only 40 feet deep. Conventional torpedoes of the era would dive 60 to 80 feet upon hitting the water, meaning they would simply bury themselves in the mud before they could level out. Japanese engineers solved this with a stroke of low-tech genius. They attached wooden aerodynamic stabilizers to the tail fins of the torpedo. These plywood flippers kept the torpedo at the perfect entry angle in the air, then shattered and fell away the moment they hit the water, allowing the weapon to level off in the shallowest of channels. The crew of the Kate operated with a hierarchy that differed significantly from Western air forces. The plane held 3 men: the pilot, the observer, and the radio operator. Often, the man in the middle seat, the observer, was the actual mission commander. He was the brain of the operation, tasked with navigation and using the Type 90 vertical tube bomb sight. The relationship between the pilot and the observer had to be telepathic. During a torpedo run, the pilot had to fly on the step just 60 feet above the waves at maximum throttle, while the observer calculated the lead on a moving battleship. It was a high-speed dance on the edge of a stall, performed under a hail of anti-aircraft fire. Training for these crews was brutal and relentless. They practiced power glide attacks, where they would dive from 3,000 feet at a steep angle and pull out at the very last second to release their torpedo. This tactic was designed to confuse anti-aircraft gunners who were used to tracking targets at a constant altitude.
By the time the gunners adjusted their aim, the Kate was already skimming the water, releasing its thunderfish and banking away. They also perfected coordinated strikes with Aichi Val dive bombers. The Vals would scream down from the clouds first, forcing the ship's gunners to look up and defend the decks, which opened a clear lane at sea level for the Kates to slide in undetected. The ultimate validation of this doctrine occurred on the morning of December 7, 1941. 40 Kates, led by Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, descended on the unsuspecting U.S. Pacific Fleet. In a matter of minutes, the modified Type 91 torpedoes ripped open the hulls of the USS Oklahoma and the USS West Virginia. The shallow-water, impossible attack had worked perfectly. For those who didn't carry torpedoes, the Kate's versatility was shown when they were loaded with 800-kilogram armor-piercing bombs converted from massive naval shells. One such bomb, dropped from a Kate, pierced the deck of the USS Arizona, leading to the catastrophic explosion that remains the most haunting image of the Pacific War. For the first 6 months of the war, the Kate was the undisputed king of the ocean. From the Indian Ocean to the Coral Sea, it dismantled Allied naval power with surgical precision. It was the plane that sank the USS Lexington and the USS Yorktown, proving that no ship, no matter how large or defended, was safe from a determined torpedo run. But the very things that made the Kate a masterpiece of engineering eventually led to its downfall. As the war progressed into 1943, the glass jaw began to shatter. The U.S. Navy introduced the F-6 Hellcat and improved the VT proximity fuse for anti-aircraft shells. Suddenly, the Kate's lack of armor and self-sealing tanks became a death sentence. The elite, highly trained crews who had won the early battles were killed off, replaced by raw recruits who couldn't handle the plane's demanding flight characteristics. The Kate, once the hunter, became the hunted, a beautiful, lethal, but ultimately fragile relic of a nation that bet everything on a single perfect strike.
If the Japanese Kate was a precision scalpel, the Grumman TBF Avenger was a 10-pound sledgehammer. By 1940, the United States Navy realized its current torpedo bomber, the TBD Devastator, was a death trap, slow, underpowered, and obsolete. They needed a replacement that could survive the brutal anti-aircraft fire of a modern carrier battle. Grumman responded with an aircraft so massive and rugged that it earned the nickname the Turkey. It was the heaviest single-engine aircraft of the entire war, a 3-man beast of burden designed not for beauty but for industrial-scale destruction. The engineering of the Avenger centered around a revolutionary feature known as the stow wing. Unlike the Japanese system, Grumman designed a patented compound angle wing fold that allowed the wings to swivel and tuck back flat against the fuselage, like a bird folding its wings. This allowed the massive Avenger to fit onto the smallest escort carriers in the fleet. Deep inside its belly was a cavernous internal bomb bay. This was a critical advancement. By housing the torpedo or 2,000 pounds of bombs inside the airframe rather than hanging them underneath, the Avenger maintained a cleaner aerodynamic profile and protected its ordnance from the corrosive salt spray of the Pacific. The Avenger's debut at the Battle of Midway in June 1942 was a catastrophe that nearly ended its career before it began. 6 Avengers were sent out to attack the Japanese fleet, 5 were shot down, and the sole survivor returned so riddled with holes that it looked like a piece of Swiss cheese. However, that one surviving plane proved the design's true worth. Despite having its hydraulic system shot away, its tailwheel If the Japanese Kate was a precision scalpel, the Grumman TBF Avenger was a 10-pound sledgehammer. By 1940, the United States Navy realized its current torpedo bomber, the TBD Devastator, was a death trap, slow, underpowered, and obsolete. They needed a replacement that could survive the brutal anti-aircraft fire of a modern carrier battle. Grumman responded with an aircraft so massive and rugged that it earned the nickname the Turkey. It was the heaviest single-engine aircraft of the entire war, a three-man beast of burden designed not for beauty but for industrial-scale destruction. The engineering of the Avenger centered around a revolutionary feature known as the stow wing. Unlike the Japanese system, Grumman designed a patented compound angle wing fold that allowed the wings to swivel and tuck back flat against the fuselage, like a bird folding its wings. This allowed the massive Avenger to fit onto the smallest escort carriers in the fleet. Deep inside its belly was a cavernous internal bomb bay. This was a critical advancement. By housing the torpedo or 2,000 pounds of bombs inside the airframe rather than hanging them underneath, the Avenger maintained a cleaner aerodynamic profile and protected its ordnance from the corrosive salt spray of the Pacific. The Avenger's debut at the Battle of Midway in June 1942 was a catastrophe that nearly ended its career before it began. 6 Avengers were sent out to attack the Japanese fleet, 5 were shot down, and the sole survivor returned so riddled with holes that it looked like a piece of Swiss cheese. However, that one surviving plane proved the design's true worth. Despite having its hydraulic system shot away, its tailwheel hanging by a wire, and a dead gunner in the turret, the Avenger's rugged Grumman Ironworks airframe had brought its pilot home. It was proof that while the Kate would ignite like a torch when hit, the Avenger could soak up unbelievable amounts of punishment and keep flying. The heart of the Avenger's defensive power was its 360-degree power-driven dorsal turret. Operated by a specialist gunner, this turret gave the Avenger a sting that few Japanese pilots expected from a lumbering bomber. In addition to the turret, the plane featured a ventral stinger gun fired by the radio man from a tunnel in the belly, protecting the aircraft from diving attacks from below. This created a defensive bubble that, when flown in tight V formations, made the Avenger a formidable target for enemy fighters. It wasn't just a bomber, it was a flying fortress in miniature. By 1943, the Avenger had become the ultimate multi-tool of the Pacific. As the U.S. Navy's industrial might grew, the Avenger was outfitted with the new ASB radar, the first of its kind to be used in a carrier-borne strike aircraft. This allowed Avenger crews to hunt Japanese ships and submarines through thick fog and the pitch black of night. They were no longer reliant on visual sightings. They became night Avengers, stalking the Japanese Tokyo Express supply runs with terrifying efficiency. The plane evolved from a simple torpedo dropper into a sophisticated electronic warfare platform. The Avenger's greatest historical contribution, however, took place in the cold gray waters of the Atlantic. Operating from tiny jeep carriers, Avengers became the primary weapon in the war against Hitler's U-boats. Armed with depth charges and the newly developed Fido acoustic homing torpedo, Avengers worked in hunter-killer groups to protect Allied convoys. They would stay airborne for hours, circling the convoys, using their radar to catch U-boats on the surface at night. In the Atlantic alone, Avengers were responsible for sinking more than 30 German submarines, effectively breaking the back of the Nazi blockade. Back in the Pacific, the Avenger was the instrument of execution for the era of the battleship. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea and the Battle of Leyte Gulf, waves of Avengers descended upon the 2 largest battleships ever built, the Yamato and the Musashi.
In a relentless display of coordinated tactics, Avengers dropped dozens of torpedoes into the same side of these behemoths to ensure they would capsize. The sight of the iron workhorse sending the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy to the bottom of the ocean signaled the final shift in naval power. The battleship was dead. The Avenger had killed it. By the end of the war, the Avenger had flown in every theater and performed every role imaginable. It dropped supplies to trapped Marines, laid minefields in enemy harbors, and even served as a primary reconnaissance platform. It was a plane that lacked the grace of the Japanese Kate, but it possessed the durability of a tank and the versatility of a Swiss Army knife.
If the Kate was a scalpel and the Avenger was a sledgehammer, the ferry Swordfish was a ghost from a different era. By 1939, every major world power had transitioned to sleek, all-metal monoplanes, yet the British Royal Navy went to war with a fabric-covered biplane that looked like it belonged in the skies over the Western Front in 1917. It was slow, it was open cockpit, and its fixed landing gear made it look utterly ridiculous compared to the modern fighters of the Luftwaffe. Yet this Stringbag, so named because it could carry anything, just like a housewife's string shopping bag, would achieve more legendary victories than almost any other aircraft in the war. The Stringbag was an anomaly of engineering. It was built around a sturdy metal frame covered in doped fabric, a construction method that made it nearly indestructible against modern weaponry. Because it was a biplane, it had an incredibly low stall speed. A Swordfish pilot could practically hover in a stiff headwind, and the plane was so maneuverable that it could turn inside the radius of any monoplane fighter. Its takeoff and landing runs were so short that it could operate from the decks of small merchant ships in heavy seas where modern planes would have crashed. The first moment the world realized the obsolete Swordfish was a deadly threat was the Battle of Taranto in November 1940. 21 Swordfish, launched from the HMS Illustris, flew into the heavily defended Italian naval base. Flying low through a forest of barrage balloon cables and a wall of anti-aircraft fire, the biplanes dropped their torpedoes with surgical precision. By the time the sun rose, half of the Italian battle fleet was at the bottom of the harbor or severely damaged. It was the first time in history that aircraft had crippled a fleet in harbor, and the Japanese Navy took meticulous notes, using Taranto as the blueprint for their attack on Pearl Harbor a year later. However, the Swordfish's most famous hour came during the hunt for the German battleship Bismarck. In May 1941, the Bismarck was the most feared ship on the ocean, having just sunk the HMS Hood. The British Navy was desperate to stop it before it reached the safety of the French coast. In a raging storm with massive waves that tilted the carrier deck of the HMS Ark Royal by over 50 feet, 15 Swordfish took off into the gale. The conditions were so bad that no modern plane could have survived the launch, but the slow, stable Swordfish rose into the dark sky. What happened next was a quirk of physics that defied modern warfare. The Bismarck was equipped with the most advanced, fire-controlled directed anti-aircraft guns in the world, but these computers were designed to track fast-moving modern bombers. The Swordfish were flying so slowly, barely 90 miles per hour against the wind, that the German gunners couldn't lead them properly. The shells were exploding hundreds of yards in front of the biplanes. The Swordfish pilots simply flew through the smoke and delivered their torpedoes. One hit the Bismarck's vulnerable steering gear, jamming its rudders. The unsinkable pride of the German Navy was left spinning in circles, a sitting duck for the British battleships closing in. As the war moved into the Atlantic, the Swordfish proved to be an elite submarine hunter. Because it flew so slowly, the pilots had more time to scan the waves for the telltale shimmer of a U-boat periscope.
The Swordfish was the first aircraft to be fitted with RP-3 rockets, allowing it to blast holes in the pressure hulls of submarines before they could dive. The Stringbag eventually sank more German tonnage than any other aircraft type in the British arsenal. It operated from MAC ships, grain ships, and tankers with a tiny flight deck bolted on top, protecting the vital lifelines of the United Kingdom through the darkest days of the U-boat blockade. The tragedy of the Swordfish occurred during the Channel Dash in 1942, when 6 Swordfish attempted to stop 3 German capital ships escorted by hundreds of fighters. All 6 biplanes were shot down, and almost all the crews were lost. It was a brutal reminder that against modern air cover, the Swordfish was a sitting duck. Yet, despite this, the Royal Navy refused to retire the plane. It stayed in frontline service until the very day Germany surrendered in 1945. It had outlasted the planes that were supposed to replace it, proving that reliability and specialized performance mattered more than top speed. The Fairey Swordfish ended the war as a contradiction. It was a relic of the past that secured the future. It proved that in the chaos of naval combat, a slow, steady platform that can fly in a hurricane is often more valuable than a fast one that has to stay in the hangar. The Stringbag was the ultimate reject that became a legend, a fabric-covered ghost that haunted the nightmares of the world's most powerful battleships and proved that even an old dog can teach the world new lessons in warfare.